The night my sister laughed at me in front of 200 people. She was wearing a dress that cost more than my monthly rent. I remember thinking that, standing in the doorway of the Carrington ballroom with my coat still on and my hands already cold. Not from the November air outside, but from the moment I saw her face change when she spotted me. That particular shift, the one she'd been doing since we were children. The slight widening of the eyes, the small pull at the corner of her mouth, and then the turn toward whoever was standing closest to her, the lean, the whisper, and then the laugh. Genevieve always had a beautiful laugh. Everyone said so. Light, unhurried, the kind of laugh that made rooms feel warmer, unless you were the reason for it. Unless you'd spent 28 years understanding exactly what that sound meant when it was directed at you. I hadn't wanted to come. I'd said that to my father 3 times in the week before the Harwick Foundation gala, and 3 times he'd found a new reason why I had to be there. The first time it was about appearances. The second time it was about the families standing with the Harwick board. The third time he'd stopped pretending there was a reason at all and just said, "Audra, you will be there." So I was there. My name is Audra Finley. I was 29 years old. I worked 60 hours a week reconciling accounts for a small logistics firm in East Toronto, and I owned exactly 2 dresses that were appropriate for a gala, both of which I'd bought second-hand from a consignment shop on Queen Street West. I was wearing the blue one. I'd spent 40 minutes trying to make it look like I hadn't found it on a rack between a sequined blazer and a bridesmaid's dress from 2009. I wasn't sure I'd succeeded. Genevieve's dress was silk, ivory, backless. She'd had her hair done that afternoon at a salon in Yorkville that charged $240 for a blowout. I knew this because she'd texted me a photo of the receipt, the way she sometimes did, a habit she'd developed sometime around the age of 17 that she'd never quite grown out of. Not cruelty, exactly. More like reminders of the gap between us, of what she had and what I didn't, and what our father had quietly decided, sometime when we were both still young enough to notice but too young to understand, about which of us was worth investing in. Audra. She said my name the way you'd say the word fine when someone asked how you were and you didn't want to answer truthfully. Drawn out. A small performance. "You came," Dad asked me to. "He asks a lot of people." She glanced at my coat, which I still hadn't taken off. Then at my shoes. "You should probably check that in. You're going to be warm." I wasn't warm. I was the precise opposite of warm. But I handed my coat to the attendant near the door and stood there in my second-hand dress in the middle of one of the most expensive rooms in downtown Toronto and watched my sister's eyes move over me with the careful efficiency of someone doing an appraisal, finding the hem slightly uneven, finding the color a half shade off from fashionable, finding all the ways I was the wrong version of a woman for a room like this. "You look fine," she said, which meant I didn't. She moved away toward a cluster of people near the bar and I heard it. The comment, murmured low, but not low enough, followed by a ripple of polite amusement from the 2 women standing with her. One of them glanced back at me. The kind of look that has a shape to it. I'd learned to recognize that shape early. It sat somewhere between pity and entertainment, and it was the worst combination in the world. I found a spot near one of the standing tables at the edge of the room, away from the center, away from the bar, close enough to the wall that I could see everything without being in the path of it. My father was somewhere near the stage, talking to someone from the Harwick board. I could see the back of his silver hair, his particular way of holding a glass, elbow slightly raised, like he was always just about to make a toast. He hadn't acknowledged me yet. The room was full of the kind of people who are born knowing how to fill rooms, the kind who take up space without effort, conversations that sounded expensive, jewelry that didn't need to try. I'd grown up on the edge of this world, close enough to understand it, far enough away to know I'd never be comfortable in it, and I'd spent most of my adult life making peace with that distance. I was looking at the ice sculpture near the east windows, a swan melting slightly at the tips of its wings, when I noticed him, or rather, when I noticed the room noticing him. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't watching carefully, but I was always watching carefully. It started near the entrance. A slight rearrangement. People who had been mid-sentence pausing, angling, not staring. These were people who knew better than to stare, but adjusting the way iron filings adjust when a magnet moves close. A clearing, a quiet. He walked into that quiet like he'd made it himself. He was tall, though that wasn't the first thing you clocked. The first thing was the stillness. The way he moved through a room full of noise and motion without any of it touching him. Dark suit, no tie, a jaw that looked like it had been in at least one conversation that didn't end with a handshake. There was something weathered in his face. Not old, maybe early 40s, but lived in the way that had nothing to do with sun or age, and everything to do with the kind of life that leaves marks. He had a scar along the left side of his chin. Small, fine, pale against the skin. I noticed it because I notice things. His name, I would learn later, was Brennan, Felix Brennan. But in that room, at that moment, he was simply the man that everyone was pretending not to watch. He didn't go to the bar. He didn't move toward any of the clusters of conversation. He accepted a glass from a passing tray without looking at it, and he stood near the north wall with the particular stillness of someone who has long since stopped needing the permission of a room to occupy it. His eyes moved across the space methodically, not looking for someone to impress, looking for something else entirely, and then his eyes landed on me. I looked away. I looked back, because I am constitutionally incapable of pretending I didn't notice something. He was still looking, not with interest, exactly. More like the way you look at an anomaly, at a thing that doesn't quite fit the pattern you've been reading. I probably didn't fit the pattern of this room, I thought. And then I thought, he's doing the same thing I'm doing, watching, cataloging, standing outside the center of everything and reading it from the edges. Then the moment passed and he looked away and I exhaled. 20 minutes later, Genevieve found me again. She had 2 of her friends with her this time. Courtney, who'd gone to the same private school Genevieve, had attended on my father's money while I'd been at the public school 4 blocks from our house, and another woman whose name I didn't catch. They were all holding champagne. They were all slightly flushed with the particular warmth of people who've had just enough to drink to stop editing themselves. There you are. Genevieve said it like she'd been looking for me. She hadn't. We were just talking about the Finley family and what we all do. Courtney smiled. The kind of smile that has work in it. Accounting, bookkeeping, I said. Account reconciliation. Right, a pause. That's very practical. It pays the rent. Genevieve laughed. There it was again. That perfect practiced sound. Audra's always been so grounded. She said it like grounded meant something she felt sorry for. It's sweet, really. Not everyone needs to be ambitious. She looked at me with something that was almost fond and was nothing like fond. You've always been happy with enough, haven't you? I felt the words go through me the way cold water does. Clean and immediate, and then just cold. I said, Genevieve, Miss Finley. The voice came from behind me. I turned. Felix Brennan was standing close enough that I hadn't heard him approach over the noise of the room, which, given that I'd been tracking his position since I first noticed him, was genuinely impressive. He was looking at me. Not at Genevieve. Not at Courtney. At me. I'm sorry to interrupt. He didn't sound sorry. He sounded like a man who had decided to do something and was doing it. I've been trying to find someone who could answer a specific question about the Harwick fund structures. Your father indicated you might be the right person. I blinked. My father said that. He said you were the most precise person in the room. He said it like a fact. No embellishment. He wasn't describing it as a compliment, I think, but I took it as one. Genevieve had gone very still beside me. The silence from her corner had a texture I recognized. Surprise, recalibration, the slight stiffening of someone who has just found the ground shift, under a certainty they hadn't thought to question. I looked at Felix Brennan. He looked back at me, and there was something in his expression that was harder to read than anything else in the room. Not warmth, not coldness, but a kind of careful attention. The way you look at a problem you've decided is worth your time. I can try, I said. Good. He gestured briefly toward the quieter end of the hall. Then walk with me. He wanted to know about a discrepancy. This was not what I'd expected. I'd expected small talk, or the performance of small talk, or some other thing I couldn't yet interpret. Instead, Felix Brennan produced a folded card from the inside pocket of his jacket, a summary of figures, printed small, the kind of document that assumed the reader already knew what they were looking at, and held it toward me without ceremony. "Third column," he said. "Second set of numbers. The reconciliation doesn't hold." I looked at it. He was right. "The variance is about 12,000, I said. "Could be a reporting lag if the fund was pulling from two different ledgers, or it could be a deliberate buffer for discretionary allocation. Who prepared this?" "Someone I'm no longer certain I trust." I looked up from the card. His face was still. His voice had been flat, not cold, but stripped of inference, the way you sound when you've decided that how you feel about something is irrelevant to the fact of it. "That's a bigger problem than the 12,000, I said. "Yes." A pause. "It is." We stood at the far end of the hall, away from the noise, and I kept looking at the figures. I'd worked with flawed ledgers for 7 years. I knew what numbers looked like when they were wrong on purpose versus wrong by accident. There's a shape to deliberate errors, a particular way they're spaced, a rhythm to where the gaps fall. You develop an instinct for it. Or you do if you've spent enough years doing this kind of work in places that don't pay well and don't notice you and don't ask too many questions about why you're still there. If I had access to the full ledger, I said, I could tell you more precisely. This is a fragment. I know. He took the card back, looked at it once, and returned it to his jacket. I was testing the fragment. Testing it. For what? For what it told me about whoever I showed it to. He looked at me directly. Not unkindly, but without the softening that most people put in their eyes when they want you to feel at ease. He wasn't trying to make me feel at ease. Most people either pretended to understand it, or told me the variance was within normal range. "You asked who prepared it." I said nothing. "That was the right question," he said, "the only one that mattered." I thought, this man is not here the Harwick Foundation. I thought, whatever his name attached to in this city, it was not philanthropic. I thought, the careful way he was watching me was the way someone watches a lock they've just found the right key for, and I wasn't sure how I felt about being a key. I said, "What exactly is it you do, Mr. Brennan?" "I manage interests," he said. "That's not an answer." No. Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, adjacent to it. "It isn't." He looked out across the room. From this angle I could see the full breadth of it. The light falling through the tall windows, the clusters of people redistributed now, dinner seating pulling them toward tables. I could see my father at his table, finally. Could see Genevieve nearby, animated, her hands moving as she talked. She hadn't looked for me since Brennan had walked me away. She was already doing the recalculation, I guessed. Reordering what had just happened. "Your father owes a debt," Brennan said, "not to me directly, but to people I have business with." The cold came back. Cleaner this time, more specific. "How much?" I said. "Enough that the gala was a performance. For benefit of people in this room who are watching whether your family can maintain appearances." He said it without judgment, like a weather report. "Your father is a good performer, but the numbers don't perform. They never do." He turned back toward me. "I need someone with your particular set of skills to go through the accounts. Find what I've already suspected is there, and make it clear enough that it can't be argued with." He paused. "I am asking you, Miss Finley, not your father. I want to be clear about that. Why? Because your father would give me what I want to hear. You'd give me what's actually there." He let that sit for a moment. I can tell the difference. I thought about my apartment, about the cost of the consignment dress I was wearing, and the fact that I'd checked my bank account that morning. And the number hadn't frightened me exactly, but it had reminded me that frightening was close. I thought about 7 years at a company that called me thorough in performance reviews, and gave the promotions to men who were less thorough but louder about it. I thought about the way Courtney had said practical, like it was something below her eyeline. I thought about the way Brennan had walked across that room without asking anyone's permission. "If I find something you don't want to find," I said, Something that complicates whatever you think you already know. Then that is what I want to find, he said. That's the entire point of doing this correctly. I looked at him. He looked back. The noise of the room was distant enough that I could hear myself think. When do we start? I said. It wasn't a question. We started the next morning. He sent a car. Not a message first. Not a call. A car, black, idling at the curb outside my building on Gerrard Street at 8:45, with a driver who said good morning without looking at me and handed me a coffee that was exactly the right temperature, which was the kind of small detail that was either a coincidence or evidence that someone had done their research, and I already knew which. The offices were in a building downtown that had no branding outside, and a lobby that looked like a law firm, if a law firm had decided to stop pretending about certain things. Clean, minimal, the kind of quiet that is not empty but controlled. I was given a desk, a computer, and access to 3 ledgers that were each more interesting than the last. No one explained who anyone was. No one offered me the full picture. This was deliberate. I understood that the way you understand rules that are never stated, but are present in the arrangement of the furniture. I was given the fragment again, this time with context. And then another fragment. And then something that was not quite a fragment, but was structured to look like one, and I recognized the pattern immediately, the way it was meant to make an auditor's eye slide past it and keep moving. I didn't let my eye slide past it. I wrote the note in the margin. Old habit. Red pen. 5 words. This is where it moves. Brennan appeared in the doorway at 2:30 without knocking, which I'd expected. He glanced at the desk, at the ledgers spread across it, at the red pen in my hand. You work like someone who doesn't trust their own memory, he said. I do trust my memory. The notes are for you, so you can't argue with where I found it. A pause. He came into the room properly, looked at what I'd marked, looked at the second notation, and then the third, and the way they connected. The movement of funds across 3 accounts that looked clean in isolation and told a very different story together. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, who taught you to read ledgers like this? No one, I said. I just paid attention when other people weren't. He looked at me. That same quality of attention, precise, evaluating, not unkind but not soft. The look of someone for whom most things are problems to be read, and this was a problem he hadn't finished reading yet. The funds moved to a second holding, I said. But there's a third account underneath the second one that doesn't appear in any of the documents you gave me. I can see the shadow of it in the variance. Someone was very careful, but not careful enough to account for the lag in the third quarter reporting cycle. Can you prove it? Give me the third quarter reports and yes. He pulled out his phone, typed something, put it away. You'll have them in an hour. Then I'll have an answer in 3. He started to move toward the door and then stopped. His back was to me. I watched the stillness in his shoulders, that particular quality he had, like a building before weather. You're not afraid of what you might find, he said. I'm afraid of plenty of things, I said. Numbers aren't one of them. He didn't turn around. But something shifted in the set of his shoulders, something slight and specific, the way a very controlled person moves when they've heard something unexpected. He left without another word. The third quarter reports confirmed everything. I laid it out across 4 pages, clean and linear, the kind of documentation that doesn't leave room for argument. The leak was not a single account. It was a person, someone with access to the internal reconciliation system, someone who understood enough about how audits were conducted to build in plausible variance, but who hadn't accounted for the full reporting cycle. The error was small, the kind of small that assumes no one is patient enough to look for it. I was patient enough. I had the name by 5:15. I didn't write it on the document. I waited. Brennan came back at 5:30. He stood in the doorway again, and this time he was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not surprise exactly, but the thing that lives next to surprise in a face that doesn't often allow either. I handed him the 4 pages. He read them standing in the doorway. He didn't move. He didn't ask me to explain anything. He read them the way someone reads something they've been waiting to have confirmed. Carefully, without rushing. not looking for the conclusion but checking the path that led to it. When he reached the last page, he looked up. "You didn't put the name," he said. "No, why? Because I wanted you to understand the path first. Names are easy to argue with. The documentation isn't." He was still for a moment. Then he walked properly into the room and set the pages down on the desk with a deliberateness that I'd come to understand was characteristic. The way he did everything. Nothing wasted, nothing accidental. "The name," he said. I told him. He absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, without visible reaction, the internal workings of it entirely his own, behind a face that had learned a long time ago not to be a window. Then he said quietly, "You're certain?" "I'm certain." The room was quiet. The building downtown had a particular quiet in the late afternoon, the street noise falling away, the light coming in at a different angle, everything slightly paused. "Your father's debt," Brennan said, "the amount he owes." I said nothing. I'd been waiting for this to come back. It's cleared. He said it the same way he said everything, like information, like weather, as of today. "Consider it a fee. You haven't even told me if the work was worth what you paid for it." It was worth considerably more. He picked up the pages, tapped them once against the desk to align them, and held them without looking at me. Then he looked at me. "You understand what this means in terms of what happens to the person whose name is on those pages?" I said, "I do." I did. I'd known from the first day what kind of ledgers these were, what kind of weight a name carried in them. I hadn't looked away from that. It wasn't something I could pretend I hadn't known, and I wasn't the kind of person who pretended. "And," he said, "and I told you I'd find what was actually there," I said, "not what was comfortable. That was the agreement." Something moved behind his eyes. Slow the way a tide moves, not dramatic but pulling. Yes, he moved toward the door. At the threshold he paused. Not quite the way he'd paused before. This was less controlled, a fraction less. The kind of hesitation that happens when a very decisive person encounters something they haven't quite resolved yet. "I'll have the car brought around," he said without turning. "For you. For tonight. I can take the subway. I know you can." He stood there for a moment in the doorway with the pages in his hand and the light from the corridor behind him, and I thought about the distance I'd always kept from rooms like the one last night, and about the look on Genevieve's face when this man had crossed that room and stopped beside me, and about the way the ledgers had looked when I first opened them, full of small, careful lies that someone had spent considerable effort constructing, and about how quickly they'd come apart under a person who knew what to look for. "Mr. Brennan," I said. He stopped. "The third account," I said, "the one underneath. The shadow I found in the variants." I paused. "There's a fourth, smaller, different structure. I didn't put it in the report." The silence had a shape to it. He turned around, slowly, looking at me in the diminished light of late afternoon, with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not the calculation, not the careful neutrality. Something beneath those. Something he hadn't, until this moment, been willing to let through. "Why not?" he said. "Because it leads somewhere you didn't ask me to look," I said. "And I wanted to know, if you wanted to know." He held my eyes across the room for a long moment. Then he said, "Set your bag down, Miss Finley." I set my bag down. "Tell me what you found." And so I did. And the city went dark outside the windows, while we stood on opposite sides of a desk, covered in the careful evidence of other people's secrets. And Felix Brennan listened to every word I said with the particular attention of a man who has spent a very long time waiting to find someone he couldn't outthink, and was, against all calculation, relieved to have finally found her.